Good afternoon, everyone. Our respected guest here, Dr. TCA Raghavan, who's former High Commissioner to Pakistan and IFS retired, and our Dean and our senior professors who's with us. A very good afternoon to everyone, my dear students, my research scholars, and everyone. I would like to welcome each and every one of you to this auspicious program. So the order of program we have today is an introduction would be made by Professor Ayangbam Kishore, faculty member of the Department of Political Science, and a welcome speech would be done by Professor Lalneihzovi, Dean, respected Dean of School of Social Sciences, and we'll be hearing a distinguished lecture from Dr. TCA Raghavan. And after that, there will be an interactive session in which the participants would like you to listen very carefully to the presentation, and from that you can ask, and whatever connected you think in your area of studies. I think with his vast experience as a foreign, as a person who had worked in the foreign embassy, I think much of your queries would be answered. So with that, I would like to invite Professor Ayangbam Kishore for his introduction speech.
Thank you, Chair. Let me introduce our honorable distinguished guest. Dr. D.C. Raghavan is a former Indian diplomat who was a 1982 batch officer of the Indian Foreign Service. He has considerable experience in South Asia policy, and he is considered as an expert on Pakistan studies. He spent his childhood days in Delhi, Jammu, and Bhopal. He finished school at Sadabatal Vidyalaya, and he studied his college in St. Stephen College. Then he moved to Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is married to Ranjana Raghavan. They have 2 daughters. He was awarded PhD degree by Jawaharlal Nehru University in 1992 in history. His dissertation was on the agrarian history of the Narmada Valley. D.C. Raghavan retired from the Indian Foreign Service in December 2015. During his entire career, he held different important positions. For example, he was the director of the Office of the External Affairs Ministry from 2000 to 2003. Then he became the Deputy High Commissioner in Pakistan from 2003 to 2007. Then from 2007 to 2009, he was posted in the Ministry of External Affairs and became the Joint Secretary dealing with Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. Then he became the High Commissioner to Singapore from 2009 to 2013. From 2013, he moved to Pakistan. He became the Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan from 2013 to 2015. Then after retirement, on July 2018, he was appointed as a Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs. His current interests are historical research, strategic analysis, and diplomatic and intellectual history of modern India. He also writes not only lectures and participates in discussion on issues related to Indian and South Asian diplomatic history, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, and Southeast Asia. He authored 3 books. First, Attendant Lords Bairam Khan and Abdul Rahim, Courtiers and Poets in Mughal India, published in 2017 by Herbert Collins. Next, The People Next Door, The Curious History of India's Relation with Pakistan. This is also published by Herbert Collins, 2017. Then the last one, History Man Jadunad Sarkar, J.S. Sardesai, Raghuveer Singh, and their Gaze for India's Past. This also published by Herbert Collins in 2020. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
For the sake of our guest, I would like to introduce the faculty and our respected dean here with us. First of all, our Professor Lalneihzovi, ma'am, she is the respected dean of the School of Social Sciences. And on her right is our senior professor from Public Administration, Professor Srinivas Pathi. And on the left of the madam is Professor Lal Tluang Liana. Laltin Tluang, I'm sorry, I beg your forgiveness, because I fondly call him as Putluang only, so I just missed his full name. Okay, he's one of the senior most professors in the public administration. And next to him is seated the head of Department of Public Administration, Muthulakshmi, Madam Muthulakshmi, yeah. Please excuse me for my. So these are the senior faculties who are sitting with us, and one senior professor is on the way from our department, Professor Zamkhongan Dongel. He'll be joining us shortly. And on the right here is our faculty of the department, and Dr. Suwalal Jangu. He's SL Jangu is fondly called as. And next to him is Dr. Pinky Lazui Tluangi, and she's a professor in Aizawl City College called Shrang Bana College. And next to her is Mimi, our guest lecturer. And last there is Melody, who's also our lecturer who's teaching here in the department. These are the faculty who's sitting with us right now. And on the left and right, these are our students and research scholars. So with that, I would end the introduction. So now I would like to give the floor to our esteemed guest, Dr. TCA Raghavan, to make his presentation. Huh? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So, order of program? Okay. So, okay, before that, let me invite Professor Lalneihzovi, the Dean, respected Dean of the School of Social Sciences, to make a few words.
Mr. Chairman, and our honorable distinguished guest, Dr. TCA Raghavan, who is an IAF retired, and my extreme senior colleague and the former Dean School of Social Sciences, Professor Srinivas Pathi, and on my left, the outgoing Dean School of Social Sciences, Professor Lalrin Tluanga. Then my head of department, Dr. Muthulakshmi, Public Administration. Then my colleague in the Department of this Political Science Department, Mizoram University, and colleagues from city colleges and young teachers, maybe from other colleges or departments, dear scholars and students. It is my proud privilege to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished guest, Dr. TCA Raghavan. So I, on behalf of the department organizing and on behalf of the Dean School of Social Sciences and Mizoram University, extend my most and warmest welcome to our distinguished guest. And it is my proud privilege to be here in your midst. Then I have been hearing, because the Dean's office is next to this room only, I used to hear then they could invite such a very important persons and such a distinguished person having a very vast experience in their own endeavor or their area where they are keeping in touch. And this is another important day, and it is very unique in its own way. I would say that SAR is having such a very good experience, especially towards neighboring countries, especially Pakistan and all. So the state of Mizoram, since the neighboring countries are Burma, Bangladesh and all, we talk mostly about this eastern side, part of the neighboring countries. So, but today we are going to hear such a very important issues from Sir with his experience. So we can hear from the introduction about his credentials, that he is 2-in-1 minimum, I should say, 2-in-1 in a way that he is an academician, obtaining even a PhD degree from a premier university of the country. So we are very proud of you for that. And I also would like to give a due recognition, being a very senior and very experienced administrator, and serving even in the foreign countries also. So your experience, whatever you can, share with us would be really a great learning and a great education for all of us also. So I'm happy that the Department of Political Science could invite you and you could spare your valuable time with us. So yesterday when they informed me that, oh, Sir could come from far distance and he must be very busy also, and then you are lucky to have him as one of the guest speakers. So that's the kind of information we were sharing to each other. So I'm very happy that also. So my very few experience regarding this, intervention in the government of India, not exactly in this way. I was involving in the Northeastern Region Vision 2020 preparation. So actually the time Manisankar Iyer, you must know him, he was also a foreign service, Indian Foreign Service also. From there he became a minister, a politician, something like that. So Look East policy had been actually one of the theme that has been stressed by this Ministry of Dollar also. So, but after the releasing of that very Look East policy, and then the vision document for the development of the northeastern areas and all, this 8 states, 7 sister states we used to call. So, but nothing was actually implemented as it was to be implemented. Then after, 2-3 years again, due to change of the government, maybe, I don't know, Act East policy has been actually adopted once again by the government of India. So if the government of India is really determined and really sincere and really, having such kind of political backup, things can be improved even for these northeastern parts of India also. So, but that might not be your purview of your lecture of this very time, but at the same time, what the government of India is having such kind of a foreign policy towards that side. So let us hear from you, and then I'm very keen to hear from you also. So with these few words, I extend my warm welcome on behalf of all of us today, and welcome to you, sir, once again, and thank you all, please.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, and I'm very grateful to the Mizoram University Department of Political Science for having invited me to come and give this lecture, and I'm glad that the Ministry of External Affairs has this program of encouraging former diplomats and former members of the Indian Foreign Service to travel across the country and try to explain what is happening in the world around us to the extent possible in different universities and different think tanks. So thank you very much, JC, for the excellent arrangements, and Dr. Janga for all the help you have given me. And thank you very much, Madam Dean, for your very warm introduction, and I'm very happy to see so many students and so many faculty members present here today. I really wish to share some thoughts about how should we approach the whole conceptual question of India and its neighborhood. Now, the first point to remember in anything to do with international relations and foreign policy, that the biggest challenge in any country's foreign policy is its neighborhood. How you deal with your neighbors defines your foreign policy. If you have to grade a country in terms of whether it has an effective foreign policy or not, you have to see how are its relations with its neighbors. If the relations are good, if they are stable, if they are on an upward trajectory, you can give them very high marks. You can give that country very high marks for having a good foreign policy. If the relations are on a downward trajectory, if they are not stable, if there are constant problems, you can immediately say there's something wrong with this foreign policy approach. So neighborhood is key for any country's foreign policy. I think that is the most important thing to remember. And the other thing to remember is that the most challenging assignments are not in the great powers, it's not in the United Nations. The most challenging assignments are in your neighborhood. And this is again the experience not just in India, but in every country in the world. That the most critical, the most challenging, the most difficult, and also the most creative and the most satisfying assignments are in your neighborhood, are in the neighboring countries. So if someone says, I'm going to a place which is very important but 2,000 miles away from my country, you can realize that, there are far more important things he could have been doing. So neighborhood is key. And let me begin with one example of why is neighborhood key. This example is not to do with India and its neighbors, but it's the central issue which the world faces today, which is the conflict in Europe and because of the conflict going on in Ukraine. Now, there are different ways of looking at what is happening in Ukraine today. You can see it in terms of a breakdown in great power relations between Russia and the United States, or you can see it in terms of the decline of a great power, which is Russia, and therefore other countries such as the United States, its former competitors, are trying to maximize on that decline of Russia. But actually the only way of looking at it is in terms of a breakdown in neighborhood relations, because Russia and Ukraine are neighbors. They share language, they share religion, they have roughly the same kind of people, they have lived together, they were part of the same country. But the fact that they could not manage their relationship to have some kind of stable outcome to their differences shows that they did not conduct their foreign policies effectively, and as a result of which both the countries are going to suffer. The whole world is, of course, dealing with it, suffering, has all the consequences we equally are facing. But certainly the countries which will lose the most from this conflict are Ukraine and Russia, because they could not manage their neighborhood policies. So it's a very good example to see as to how essential neighborhood relations are with us, are for us. Because you can have different theories, it's because the conflict broke out because of the eastward expansion of NATO. But the question is that why did these two countries allow things to go so far? It is essentially because they could not manage their neighborhood relations effectively and properly and in their long-term interest. And this is really the salutary lesson for a country like India, because our neighborhood, as I said, is central to our overall development. We cannot develop in the way we want. We cannot become a middle power or a great power. We cannot face all the challenges of unemployment, poverty, economic development, whatever challenges we face, unless we deal with our neighborhood creatively and effectively. So the Ukraine example is something which we should all keep in mind, that if you don't manage your neighbors properly or you don't have an effective neighborhood policy, this is how bad things can become. It's the worst case scenario, but one should always keep the worst case scenario in mind. Now, this is also a good time to talk about neighbors, because in India itself, while we have been, we are for the past year or so been recovering from a major pandemic, as has the rest of the world. Pandemic recovery, there are different views. Are we recovering fast enough, or is it a slower recovery than was expected? But we are recovering from a pandemic. It has taken a great toll on the economy, on the society. And in this, it's not just India. Most countries in the world are in a similar position. The second issue is that you have this conflict in Europe, which has a major impact on your economy. If the European economy, if the US economy go into a recession, if hydrocarbon prices go up enormously, immediately your own economy will take a big hit. So it has a big impact on you. But most of all, your neighborhood is in a state of major crisis and turmoil. And you can see examples from the past 1 year or so from 4 countries. The first is Myanmar, because as you all know, last year there was a coup, change of government, there's a great deal of internal turmoil and churn, and it's an immediate neighbor. It impacts us in numerous ways, because if we say we have a northeast, look east policy, it's a look east policy only because we can effectively deal with Myanmar. Because there's no way we can look east or act east without first dealing with Myanmar. If Myanmar is unsettled, if Myanmar is not stable, if there is internal conflict over there, none of your plans for Act East will work. So Myanmar is one example, the change of government, the coup, the sanctions which have been imposed. The second example is what happened in Afghanistan last year. Again, major change in the whole architecture of Afghanistan took place, because for 20 years the United States had put up a certain system over there, and the United States was defeated and it vacated amongst chaos. We ourselves suffered a great strategic setback, because we had to close our embassy, evacuate our personnel. All the projects which we were doing have suffered a great deal because of from that. So big change in Afghanistan. Again, a very important neighbor. The third is what happened in Sri Lanka. If you see in Sri Lanka, because of the combined impact of government policies, and the pandemic, and the war in Ukraine, the country went into a kind of a downslide. The economy tanked. They weren't left with enough money to import hydrocarbons and other essential supplies. So again, very important, very significant neighbor in major turmoil. And the fourth is Pakistan. Pakistan also, for the last 7-8 months, for various reasons, internal political reasons, external factors, the impact of the pandemic, the impact of the conflict in Europe, Pakistan itself is in a major crisis. So to a considerable extent, you can say our entire neighborhood is going through a very, very troubled period. And this is really the real challenge which Indian foreign policy faces, because firstly you have to make sure that you are not that the negative impacts of these of the instability in your neighbors doesn't come into India itself. Secondly, you have to see what can you do about it. In some cases, like in Sri Lanka, maybe you can do something. In other cases, such as in Pakistan, there's nothing you can do, or maybe there's not much you can do. But at the same time, you should know what is happening, and you should be prepared to deal with the consequences of what's happening. So this is by way of introduction as to how important our neighborhood is, and at this particular point of time, what are the central issues which we are facing in our neighborhood policy. Now, I have just a few slides just to illustrate my point. One thing is that because India is such a large country, let me show you the next one. Yeah, this is we obviously have many neighbors which are with whom we have a land boundary. So you have Pakistan, you have China, you have Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Myanmar. Uh, Depending on how you use the term line of control, you can say we also have a border with Afghanistan, but you have land boundaries with many important neighbors. Apart from your immediate neighborhood, there's a larger neighborhood which includes Iran, Central Asia, because they are also really part of your neighborhood. But these are basically countries with whom you deal with as those with whom you have a land boundary. But because of India's geographical position, you also have maritime neighbors. Because, India is not just a country which has land boundaries, it has a huge maritime presence also. So you have both on the east coast and on the west coast, you have many neighbors. The immediate neighbors are, of course, Sri Lanka and Maldives, but to your east, you have all the Southeast Asian countries stretching into East Asia and the Pacific and what is now called the Indo-Pacific. Then to the west, you have all the Gulf Arab countries, Iran, Iraq, and stretching all the way to the east coast of Africa. So really your maritime neighborhood is one set of issues, and your continental neighborhood is another set of issues. So whenever you talk about Indian foreign policy, the two things to remember is that you have a continental set of issues and you have a maritime set of issues. So in brief, your neighborhood is both continental and maritime. So you have neighbors such as Pakistan, with whom you have, of course, land boundaries, but you also have a maritime boundary. But there are other neighbors such as Nepal or Bhutan, with whom you only have land boundaries because they are landlocked countries. Similarly, Bangladesh, again, you have both land boundary and also maritime boundary. Myanmar, again, you have both land boundary and maritime boundary. But the general point is that you are both a continental country and you are also a maritime country. It's not just one. There are always two issues. And whenever you are doing something, you always have to think that, okay, I'm doing this dealing with China as a continental neighbor because we have a standoff on the line of actual control. But we can't forget that China is also a maritime neighbor. So what do you do with China in the Indian Ocean is always a question which will come up, and therefore you will then have discussions about Indo-Pacific and Quad and so on. So essentially your neighborhood is continental and maritime. Now when you're looking at maritime, your maritime neighborhood, it's very important to keep this big difference between your east and your west. Because on your east, you have the Bay of Bengal and the Eastern Indian Ocean, which then stretches into the Pacific. And on the west, you have the Arabian Sea, which is part of the Western Indian Ocean, and it goes all the way to the east coast of Africa. So what is the difference between the east and the west is always something to keep in mind. Because we use act east and look east as a mantra, but what does it mean? Why is it so important to act east? Why don't we give the same emphasis to looking west? Now the reason for that is that if you look at the Bay of Bengal, and not just the Bay of Bengal but also the Eastern Indian Ocean, you find on the whole the Bay of Bengal and the Eastern Indian Ocean is a zone of cooperation. You have ASEAN, you have the East Asia summit process. So there is a community of countries which have reached various agreements. And India also became part of that process because we started taking more interest in ASEAN and more interest in what was happening in Southeast Asia. So to our east we find this vast area which is generally a very, very cooperative phase. So you have a lot of intergovernmental agreements on trade, on cultural exchanges, on connectivity, and it becomes much easier dealing with it. So for instance, the kind of steps which we have taken with ASEAN in terms of Look East and Act East will, if they are effective, lead to a big change in the way our country gets connected with the wider Asian continent to our east. Now, why am I saying this? Because when you look west, which is the Arabian Sea or the Arabian Sea littoral, you will find that the same kind of cooperative structure doesn't exist. You have Iran fighting with Saudi Arabia. You have all kinds of unresolved issues between Iran and Iraq, Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iran and Pakistan, Pakistan and India, Afghanistan and Pakistan. So your western neighborhood is much more prone to conflict and it is much more troubled neighborhood than your eastern neighborhood. It's not as if there are no problems in the east. You have, of course, situations in Myanmar. Next year there's an election in Bangladesh. We don't know what will happen. But on the whole, your western neighborhood is much more fragile, much more prone to conflict, much more unstable. And this really is something which becomes even more significant when you see the wider issues which are taking place, for instance, in Ukraine, or because of Russia and the United States, what's happening in Central Asia. But I don't want to go too much into that detail, but this was the broad contrast I wanted to make before I come to to our immediate neighbors, now which are well known. Which are our immediate neighbors? Everyone knows which are our immediate neighbors. You have China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, etc., etc. So why have I put China and Pakistan in one category and the others all together? Because the challenges you face from them are of a different order. You have had problems with all your neighbors, but the kind of problems you have had with China and Pakistan, you have not had with other neighbors. So they stand in a case apart. And these are, now, I really want to make only 2 points, because then we can discuss each of these countries, if you like, in your questions. But one of the points is that each of our neighbors is a universe in itself. There is no way that in one lecture you can cover all your neighborhood countries. Each of these countries, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Nepal, is a universe in itself. You can have 20 lectures on each of them and still not exhaust all the points which are relevant. Similarly with China and Pakistan. So, but are there any general issues which we as Indians and those of us who are studying international relations have to be constantly aware about when we look at any of these countries? I think there are a few general issues, and I'll touch very briefly on them. Now, the first issue is something which is quite obvious, that while we think of our neighborhood and our neighbors think of us as one entity, for instance, it's like India dealing with, for instance, Myanmar, or India dealing with Bangladesh. The reality is never so simple. The reality is more complex, because it's not as if you have New Delhi dealing with Dhaka, which defines India-Bangladesh relations. It's not that. Because in the end, India and Bangladesh, or the territories which comprise India and Bangladesh, have been dealing with each other for centuries, for thousands of years, even before there were sovereign governments in Delhi and in Dhaka. So neighborhood relations are deeply dependent on the sub-regional dynamics. My point in brief is that while sitting in Delhi, we can make policy about Myanmar, that policy will only be an effective policy if it takes into account those parts of India which are immediately next to Myanmar. That is really the challenge of neighborhood policy, that it's not an abstract issue, it's deeply dependent on your domestic politics and how your domestic politics affects your external policies. So when you look at Bangladesh, can you make policy in Delhi without looking at how Assam looks at Bangladesh, or how West Bengal looks at Bangladesh, or how Mizoram looks at Bangladesh? Obviously you can't. So policy will always be a kind of a compromise between what the federal or the central government wants and what the state governments, which are immediately next to Bangladesh, want. And this applies to all our neighbors. This is one general point to keep in mind. And it applies to the, if you look at the complexities of each of our neighbors, this issue will come up. That with Nepal, how we view things in Nepal from New Delhi is quite different from how Nepal may be viewed from, let's say, Bihar, or how Nepal may be viewed from West Bengal. There's a big difference. Similarly, if you look at Sri Lanka, now Sri Lanka thinks of India in two ways. They think of India as comprising New Delhi, the government of India in Delhi, with which their embassy is there, they deal with it directly. But they also think of India as Tamil Nadu. To many of them, India is like one huge Tamil Nadu. So your sub-regional dynamics is critical in neighborhood policy. And how effective your neighborhood policy is will be greatly dependent on to what extent those states, those parts of the country which immediately abut an external neighbor, how much they are stakeholders in your policy. Because if they are not stakeholders, that policy will not be successful. And this is something to keep in mind with regard to any policy which is framed. And Madam, you had referred to the Vision 20 document and Look East and Act East. I think what the government didn't do for a long time, the Act East was a policy made in Delhi, that it is good for a country like India to have closer relations with Southeast Asia. The intervening space got forgotten, that you cannot have Act East unless the Northeast is there to act as a bridge to Southeast Asia. So I think that point is better understood now than it was maybe 20 years ago or 25 years ago. I think cumulatively it is getting better understood. And I honestly feel that unless each of the states of the Northeast becomes a total stakeholder in your Act East policy, that policy will not be effective. Of course, when you come to China and Pakistan, there are other complexities, because these are neighbors with which you have deeply adversarial relations. With China, you have even more complex situation, because for the first time, you now have a great power which is in your immediate neighborhood. You know, the whole of Indian foreign policy, if you read from the 50s till about 10, 15 years ago, our whole approach was that let's try to keep great powers out of our immediate region, because if there are great power rivalries in our immediate region, it's bad for our region, it's bad for us, so we should try to keep great powers out. So to a great extent, this was our policy with regard to the Soviet Union, with regard to the United States, that we don't want the Cold War becoming part of South Asian politics. But now that reality is changed, because it's no longer a question of keeping a great power out. You already have a great power who is part of your region in the form of China. And the Chinese, the rate of the way the Chinese have transformed their economy in the last 20, 25 years, it has become a major foreign policy, defense policy, economic policy issue for you. Now, in the long term, of course, there is no answer except for you to develop your own economy in the same way. But that is in the long term. For the immediate moment, you are left with this big asymmetry of power between China and India. In economic power, in military power. So you have a major issue that you have a great power immediately next to you. You have land borders. It's your continental neighbor. It's also a maritime neighbor. You have a history of adversarial relations. And China itself is now in a nationalistic phase and is acting in ways which are making all its neighbors very, very apprehensive. So that issue is something which is going to affect not just your relations with China, but will impact each of your relations in the neighborhood. Because if you are a small country next to a big country, it is natural that that small country will try to make friends with other big countries to balance you. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not malign. If Nepal tries to develop strong relations with China, it may be against our interest, but they are doing the natural thing. We have to find the right way of dealing with it. We can't say that you are doing something wrong, because the whole of geopolitics is based on such presumptions, that you try to balance one big power by having dealings with another big power. So this is an issue which you will face constantly with your with each of your neighbors. To some extent you have faced it with Pakistan for the last 25, 30, maybe even longer, 40, 50 years. That the Pakistanis have developed a very strong relationship with China to balance you, to deter you. And they feel with some justification that they have succeeded. Whether they have or not is a different question. Different people have different answers. To my mind, they have not really succeeded, because the kind of foreign policy they have followed with regard to India, with regard to Afghanistan, has really led to the country itself going downhill for a long period of time. So if the country is going downhill, there's no point talking about how effective a foreign policy it has had. Obviously, the foreign policy has been a failure. How much time should I speak for? Another? 10 minutes? Okay, then let me come to 2 or 3 points which are my favorite, because I like looking at international relations from a historical perspective. So I want to talk about how our neighborhood gets impacted by external factors. The war in Ukraine is a good example, because whatever has happened in Sri Lanka and to some extent in what is happening in Pakistan today is greatly impacted by the situation in Europe. But let's go back a little bit in history and look at what happened in 1979. Now, 1979, what does it have to do with our neighborhood? It has everything to do with our neighborhood. Our whole worldview, our entire foreign policy thinking required a big change in 1979, because 6-7 changes took place together, more or less together. What happened? You had a revolution in Iran. The Shah was toppled, and a new revolutionary, Islamic revolutionary regime came to power. In Pakistan, you had the execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Big setback for the forces of democracy, from which they have still not recovered. In Saudi Arabia, at the same time, you had a group of Islamic extremists who took control of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. And it was really a kind of a announcement to the world that Islamic extremism has arrived as a political force. Then the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, 1979. Again, a big change. US, China established diplomatic relations. Their relations had been improving from 1972-73, but formal diplomatic relations were established only in 1979, and China began on the four-path modernization, modernization of economy, modernization of military, etc., etc. And finally, China and Vietnam had a border war. So how do these factors impact us? If you look at each of them, you will realize that your neighborhood policy required a big change because of these factors, all of which happened without your being able to do anything about it. So everything in international affairs is not in your control. You can have the best policy, but things may happen which may make that policy ineffective. So let me just take China-Vietnam border war. How did it impact us? You see, we took a certain position on the China-Vietnam border war. We basically took the Vietnamese side. And the war led to a occupation of Cambodia by Vietnamese forces, which we did not criticize. We were supportive about it because there had been a genocide and Pol Pot had been overthrown. But the impact of that was that ASEAN shut the door on us. So while there had been talk about having better relations with Southeast Asia, with ASEAN from the 60s, from the 70s, the 1979 developments, primarily because of Vietnam-China border war and then the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, meant that ASEAN shut the doors on you. So your Look East policy had to wait for another decade and a half before it could be implemented. So it has an immediate impact on your neighborhood. Similarly, if you look at 1989, just 10 years later, you have another 6, 7 issues happen all together, and your whole situation changes. The Soviets withdraw from Afghanistan, the Cold War ends, the Berlin Wall comes down, the Soviet Union, it appears, is now going to break up. Insurgency begins in Jammu and Kashmir, largely because the Pakistanis felt that they had defeated the Soviets in Afghanistan, and that same tactic can be applied against India and Jammu and Kashmir. So you have the beginnings of an insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir, and you have the Tiananmen Square events in China. Again, it has a tremendous impact on India-China relations, India-Pakistan relations, India-Afghanistan relations, and so on. Now, why do I say this? I say this because often when you're dealing with your neighbors, even your closest neighbors, there may be extraneous developments over which you have very little control, which can have a major bearing on how your relations with that country will develop. So if you look at Myanmar and Myanmar under sanctions because of the coup over there, now you are in no position to impact that process. You cannot make the United States or Europe reduce the intensity of the sanctions on Myanmar. And as long as those sanctions remain, many of your projects, many of your programs, many of your plans cannot be implemented effectively. The same applies to Iran to some extent. So your neighborhood policy gets impacted by the outside world in a way which you cannot control, and it's getting more complicated now because of the major role which China plays in each of your immediate neighbors. Let me now come to the final point, which is about regional cooperation. And as I said at the beginning, your neighborhood policy defines how effective or good or robust your foreign policy is. And now this is understood, it's been understood for many years, and it is recognized that with your neighbors you must try to have a more cooperative relationship. And that is how ideas such as SARC came up. Then SARC went into problems because of India-Pakistan relations. But now you have BIMSTEC, BBIN, you have other methods of developing regional cooperation through ASEAN, through the Indo-Pacific, because the Indo-Pacific also is intended to have a strong regional cooperation element. So really, regional cooperation consisting of connectivity, economic cooperation. That is the key and the way forward to looking at regional cooperation and the way ahead. Now, how do you bring about, how do you reconcile, or how do you smoothen the interface between a cooperative approach and the kind of historical issues you have faced with your neighbors? If you look at Pakistan, you look at Afghanistan, you look at China. In your northeast, you have Bangladesh, Myanmar. Again, a lot of historical, lot of legacy issues which can constantly interrupt your relationship. I think that really is the challenge for Indian foreign policy ahead, that how well we manage the legacy issues, the disputed issues with Pakistan, with Bangladesh, not so much, but certainly with Nepal, with each of our neighbors. As I said, the relationship is a universe in itself, and how you manage it and how you deal with it and how you stabilize it will be the major test and check of your foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Raghavan, for the presentation, inspiring presentation, I should say. Now, I would like to open the floor for an interactive session. So we will take questions from the floor, and then if our esteemed guest speaker may kindly react to, those who are to ask the questions, please introduce yourself, your name, and the your class to which you belong. Okay, so now the floor is open to anyone who would like to make a question.
Hello, sir. I'm T. Lalneihzovi, PhD research scholar from Department of Political Science. And sir, I have a very simple question. There is a saying that in order to have a good and maintain good relationship with the neighboring countries, the first and foremost key is to maintain peace. So it is regarded as peace is the key or solution to have a good relationship. So according to you, what will be the best solution to have and maintain a good relationship with the neighboring countries? Thank you, sir.
Well, unfortunately, there's no straightforward answer. There's no, as they say, there's no magic bullet or no silver bullet which, if you fire, will solve the problems. Your neighborhood will continue to remain a challenge. Those countries with which you had very good relations 10 years ago, your relations may not be good in the future. Those with which you had very bad relations 20 years ago, your relations may dramatically improve. So there's no easy solution. There's no one answer which is going to be valid for all times to come, because India is changing, your neighbors are changing, and the wider environment around you is changing. So it's not as if there is some formula which we have somehow missed out, and if we use that, it will work. No, it doesn't work like that. I mean, I'll give you one example. In Pakistan, a lot of people used to say that, India and Pakistan, 70 years have gone past. You people have bad relations, and this is the advice they used to give, because you don't have any economic relations. If you trade with each other, you will have better relations. I mean, there's this view that countries which trade with each other, which have strong economic ties, they will have good relations with each other. It's not so. You can trade as much as you like with Pakistan. It will not change the nature of your relationship, because there are political issues which have to be handled. So if you look at what is happening in Ukraine today, I mean, look at the economic ties between Russia and Europe. It didn't stop a conflict from breaking out. The Americans thought for a long time that the way to deal with China is to integrate China economically. The opposite happened. The Chinese integrated the United States. So my point is that there's no one simple thing which we can do. Each of our neighbors is a different universe. It has its own character, own expectations, own requirements. You have to attend to each of them as a matter of detail. To my mind, what we have to pay attention to is, and I think we are doing it, but we can do much more of it, is to involve the neighboring states much more in our dealings with our neighbors. It's not easy. It's easy in the case of Myanmar, for instance, to involve Mizoram, to involve other states in the northeast in dealings with Myanmar. But if you're dealing with Pakistan, it's not easy to involve Jammu and Kashmir in dealings with Pakistan. So it's not easy, but it is one thing which we can do much more than we have done. But as I said, there's no simple formula, there's no one answer which will solve your problems.
A very good afternoon, sir. My name is Andy El Kobung. I'm from Government Rangbang College. Sir, my question is, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's been a huge tension between the West and Russia, and India being depending significantly on arms supplies, and to counter China, India requires the support of the United States. So India is walking on a very tight rope. And according to you, what should be India's foreign policy in tackling this dilemma, sir?
You know, this is something which is being discussed all the time, so it's a very good question. In my own view, there is a Western narrative that India is taking a particular position which they interpret as being supportive of Russia. India has to do this because of its compulsions, because you import so much arms from Russia, you have no option, you have compulsions. Actually, I don't agree with that view. In my view, your general approach has been that try not to get involved in something which is not directly your business. It's not a black and white simple situation between Ukraine and Russia. There's no moral issue involved in it. In my view, in these kind of situations, our general policy, but also our gut instinct, has been that don't get involved. And even without the dependence on Russia for the arms, I think we may have taken the same position. Because the Western narrative and the US view, they often function in echo chambers, and they tend to think that this is a black and white issue, this is absolutism versus democracy, and every democracy has to take the side they are on. It's not so simple. I think in India, firstly, there's much more sympathy with Russia, because the Russians for the last 20-25 years have been saying that you're pushing us too far. There's also less sympathy with Ukraine. People feel sympathy, because of what it has suffered, because there's a war taking place, people have been killed, other countries have got impacted, we have got impacted. But still there is a feeling that you should not have allowed your relations with Russia to go so far down. I think it's a lesson which we all have to keep in mind. As I said at the beginning, your neighborhood is your responsibility. If tomorrow you have a major breakdown in relations with China, it would not be something in your interest. And while there may be others who are pushing you to take a stronger position, in the end it is your responsibility to manage your relations, that you don't go into a worse situation. So in India, the feeling is that the Ukrainians did not give enough attention to their relationship with Russia, and it's a mistake. And I think this is something which we expect all our neighbors also to keep in mind. That it's one thing, yes, you want to use China to balance India, but in the end, your responsibility remains of how you deal with India. So you should not let things go so far. so far that it leads to a conflict type of situation. So my feeling is that our policy with trying to maintain a certain balance, but not getting too much involved in the intricacies of this conflict, and most of all, not taking a moral position on it. You don't want to blame anyone for it. It's the right approach.
Sir, I am Dr. Babu Gopal from the Department of Public Administration. Sir, I don't have a question. It's just a query as to, or you can share your views. When it comes to democracy in Asia, we are one of the few countries with we are surviving with democracy, like South Korea and others. But none of our neighbors are in a way to adopt these democratic practices, or even I can say that even they don't have the moderate level of democratic principles in their political system. But whereas in Europe, the countries which are there, which were not democratic ones, they've all turned democracy now. So in your opinion, what do you feel that where did we fail in influencing our neighbors in bringing democracy? Because as you already aware of, democracy is mostly the solution for all these conflicts that we have. So I request you to please share your views, sir.
In my view, you have to see democracy as a process. You can't see it as something static, that A is democratic and B is not democratic. So, Europe, to build the kind of democracies many of its countries has, and some of them are very, very advanced democracies, they went through a very painful period of 2 centuries. And if you look at the kind of conflicts which they have gone through, even in the last century, the First War and the Second World War, you realize the enormous pain they went through. But basically what happened in Europe, if you stand back and look at, let's say, 1900 to end of the 20th century, basically what happened in Europe was that they went through a very painful process of conflict to make countries converge with ethnic homogeneity. So one country means same ethnicity, same language, same culture. And the First World War was basically a half attempt to break up empires and make borders of countries the same as linguistic and cultural and religious borders. The Second World War completed that process. Now, in Asia, because of the way countries were colonized, many people at that time felt it was too painful a process to try to reorder all that. So you have countries which are ethnically, linguistically, religiously heterogeneous, which makes them prone to conflict and which makes democracy a much more difficult and longer term process. So I think in Asia, many countries in Asia are struggling with that, just like we are. In France it's easy, everyone speaks French, but in India you don't have one language where everyone can identify with. We have to speak to each other in English. So those kind of issues are much more complex in Asia, because you didn't want to go through the process of making national boundaries, linguistic boundaries and cultural boundaries. You see, which is really what happened in Europe. The second thing is, I'm not so cynical as you. When you say that there's not much democracy in Asia, it's actually not so. Because if you look at your immediate neighborhood, Bhutan is becoming a kind of democracy out of choice. They didn't need to. There was no opposition to the king. He didn't need to devolve power, but he decided to do so. Nepal similarly has moved from a monarchy to a democracy in about 20 years, less than 20 years. Very painful, very difficult process, but on the whole they have kept they have kept to it. In Pakistan, for the last 40-50 years, there's this constant struggle between democracy and military rule, but it's not as if it's a one-sided process. You know, it's a real struggle. Similarly with Myanmar. So I'm not so cynical as you, but as I said, democracy is a process. You know, you can't say that country X is a perfect democracy and other countries are not democratic.
Sir, thank you very much for your enlightening speech. Just for the sake of us and the students in particular, you are one of the insiders of Indian and Pakistani diplomatic circles. So what we find in textbooks, in media, even in social media is different. But what exactly is the ground reality in India-Pakistan relationship? What you have found in your long career in Pakistan?
You see, I spent in all living in Pakistan 7 years, and then I dealt with it in Delhi for a number of years. It was not by choice. Sometimes by accident, you know, you become classified as a Pakistan fellow, so they keep sending you back there. There's a big contrast between what the media projects and what exists in reality. Pakistanis, if you go there and on the street, they are totally fascinated by Indians. You know, they have, at the popular level, at the person-to-person level, there is no hostility at all. In fact, they're really interested. And the Pakistanis, they may not admit it, but they admire India. You know, they admire the fact that you're multi-religious, multi-ethnic, pluralistic, secular. In many ways, they think that this is the way ahead. They also admire the fact that you invested in education, you set up IITs, they think that all the things they didn't do, India did right. Finally, the common person, he has been brought up on a diet of Bollywood. So they all watch Bollywood movies and they think India is like what Bollywood is showing. So on the whole, when I lived in Pakistan, I felt that the common perception in Pakistan is very soft about India. Indian perceptions are very hardline. But I am talking about the common persons. You see, government and government policy is different. You see, and there you come across a different view, because there the view is a single one, that K, Pakistan, we all know the spelling. In their view, K in Pakistan stands for Kashmir. So without Kashmir, Pakistan is incomplete. So this is the government view. So the challenge for Indian foreign policy is that you have to deal with the government, but you also have to take into account that the popular view is different. And how to manage the two is not easy. You know, for the last 5-6 years, we have basically not dealt with Pakistan as a country or as with the people. We have dealt with the government. That if you do X, we'll do Y. If you use terrorist instruments, you will pay the price. But in foreign policy, you have to also combine that with other things. You know, one is taking measures, dealing with the government, taking a hard line. But we shouldn't forget that there's also a different view which you should also try to deal with all the time.
Hello, sir. I'm Jerry from Political Science Department. I'm a PhD scholar. My question is that by looking the history of Pakistan, we have experienced that there have been political instability in Pakistan. If I'm not mistaken, none of the prime minister have completed their term, 5-year terms. So, in your opinion, does this political instability affect the Indo-Pakistan relation? And my another question is that Sarpati have asked what I'm intended to ask. You have mentioned about the Indo-Pakistan relation, and I want to ask you, is there any pros and cons or anything which can be done to improve the relation? Your personal opinion, sir.
Well, good questions. You see, yes, political instability in Pakistan has a huge impact on relations with India. Basically, you can say that in the last 25 years, your relations have not improved with Pakistan because of political instability over there. Because whenever you tried to do something with the political parties, with the civilian governments, the military didn't like it. When you tried to do something with the military, the political parties didn't like it. But more than you know, because they are fighting with each other, they try to drag you into their fight. And that makes it very difficult to know what to do. So this is one problem with Pakistan. It's not a question that the military doesn't want to deal with you. Military wants to deal with you, but they don't want anyone else to deal with you because they don't trust the politicians. The politicians feel that why should the military deal with foreign policy? This is a political issue. We have to deal with it. So in this struggle, you cannot make much progress. So until some kind of internal situation becomes more stable in Pakistan, nothing much can be done. It doesn't mean nothing can be done. Some things can be done, but nothing much can be done. But what are the steps we can take? It's not easy. You know, governments have tried various things. But if you, let's say, if you say that, look, I think we should try to have a more normal relationship with Pakistan, you can have some cultural exchanges, some trade, some people-to-people exchanges, educational exchanges. This was tried, and it's certainly worth trying again. But it's very difficult to implement such a policy if there are 2 or 3 major terrorist attacks. You know, if people get killed, the government, you know, they are under tremendous pressure. That how can you allow this? How can you continue trade? And why should you allow Pakistani singers to come to India when our people are being killed? So as a long-term policy, it may be desirable, but in the short term, it becomes politically impossible. And this is the constant dilemma on Pakistan policy. In my view, you know, you cannot deal with Pakistan only as a security issue or a military issue. Because there are many Pakistanis who are very happy when India deals with Pakistan as a military issue. Because they know, and we also know, that there is no military solution to your problems. So if you want to deal with Pakistan more creatively, then you have to use your other strengths, you know, which is your economy, your society, your culture. That is a good, but as I said, it's very difficult to implement. The other problem which has now become quite severe, I don't know whether you feel it here, but in North India, it's very evident. Public opinion has become totally jaundiced. You know, public opinion to some extent in India now thinks of a world without Pakistan. They think that it's too, you know, Pakistan is left behind, it's not important, we have advanced, they have lost the race. It's not true. You know, one of our former prime ministers once said that you can't change your neighbors. You have to deal with your neighbors. But public opinion in North India, especially North India, has become totally rigid and, you know, very jaundiced, as I said.
Sir, good afternoon, sir. My name is Jacob. I'm a 5th semester student from Government Shangwana College. My question to you is, after having served as a distinguished officer to Pakistan, what, according to you, could be the major keys to resolve the issues regarding Kashmir, be it externally or internally?
You know, there was earlier a question that which is one thing which we should be doing. With neighbors, you realize that there are some problems which cannot be solved. Like Kashmir, there is no solution because there can't be a solution. In Pakistan's view, K in Pakistan stands for Kashmir, and without Kashmir, Pakistan is not complete. In the Indian view, Kashmir is an integral part of India. So you cannot reconcile these two positions and have a compromise. Because this is not a question of, it's not a technical issue. This is the ideological and foundational issue. Both countries are formed on the basis of certain foundational principles, and those foundational positions will not change. So Kashmir comes in the middle of that. So there's no solution which anyone can. So what you have to do is you have to live with the problem. And there are many other examples around the world of countries which have irreconcilable differences, but it doesn't mean that they don't have stable relations. So you have to, now to some extent between 2004 and 2010 or 11, you tried to make an effort that let's try to live with this. So let's try to soften the border, have more economic exchanges, cultural exchanges, make the borders less relevant. That if you have a wider unity, then the internal differences become less important. A bit like the EU. That, for instance, in England, in the UK, they discovered it was much easier dealing with the Irish problem because both were becoming members of the European Union. So many issues could be solved through the EU route rather than through the bilateral route. So something like that was attempted between India and Pakistan. That you allow buses to go across the LOC, you have trade across the LOC, and maybe it is some kind of a way out, that you cannot address the foundational principles. Because Pakistan will not drop Kashmir from Pakistan. And in India there will be never any compromise on the fact that it's an integral part of India. But one way is you freeze the issue, that maybe 100 years later, and try to build a bigger cooperative kind of structure so that these differences then don't become so important. But for that, then you need a certain stability in Pakistan, you need a certain vision in Pakistan. And without that, you can't implement these kind of, in any case, they're not easy. As I said, it was tried and it failed. So to try it again, you need a different kind of ecosystem in Pakistan.
Okay, so I have a question. Dr. Aisha Zathangi from Government Shambana College. When Sir Pathi was talking about media, I kind of immediately thought about this movie, Bajrangi Bhaijaan. Salman Khan was in it, so it was all about the border movement, the border issues. And also actors from Pakistan are also very popular these days, like Mahira Khan and all that. Over the years, has this media played, what kind of role do you think played in the decision making or the foreign policy, making of foreign policy? And not only between India and Pakistan, but the world over, because it has totally changed. Like media here is now a platform for discourse. It's borderless, free, you could say that. And so generally, from the Cold War time to now, what kind of role do you think media has played in foreign policy?
My view, I'm going to say something, but it doesn't mean that anything can be done about it. But in my view, the media has played a negative role. It doesn't mean that you can change the media or you should not have a media. It's one more fact of life, that the media has generally played a negative view. Why do I say that? I say it because the nature of the media is to exaggerate or to amplify. They can't change that, because good news is not news, bad news is news. They can't change that basic, it's part of the SOP, that operating principle can't be, operating system can't be changed. So when you look at sensitive relationships, for instance, India-Pakistan, India-China, the media plays a negative role. Because yes, you have serious differences, yes, you have major problems, but then when they are exaggerated further, it conveys an even more negative image, which gets solidified in people's minds. So for instance, in India today, we have almost got conditioned that the Chinese are malign, the Chinese are, hegemons, they are out to dominate us. Now it may be true, because you have major problems, you have an adversarial relationship, but the pitch and the intensity with which those claims are made may be exaggerated. Because it is, after all, still your largest trading partner. There must be some things right in China, there must be some things good in China, that they could achieve this kind of economic development in 30, 35 years, which no other country has been able to do. It can't just be that there are, that they are totally dictatorial, hegemonistic. So, but the media doesn't go into those nuances. It's a black and white picture, and it makes people simplify situations. I don't think there's a solution to it, because, because in the end, in a democracy, you have to have media. You can't do without it. But it is a factor which you have to keep in mind.
May I raise one or two small questions? We have been talking about Lucky's policy and now Aki's policy. And in this regard, are we too late as Indians to pursue this Lucky's policy and Aki's policy? The reason being that soon after in India's declaration of Lucky's policy, the Chinese government changed its direction towards Myanmar, and those untrodden areas in the southern part of China were developed by China's government like anything. And do you think we, the Indians, are too late in pursuing our Lucky's policy and Aki's policy? That is question number one. Now, in Myanmar, there is, if I use the word lawlessness, it may be too strong, but due to coup, there is no any people's government and all that. Military juntas are ruling over the public. And in the meanwhile, China is secretly sneaking into China in order to pursue its socio-economic interest. Similarly, in Sri Lanka, we know, due to consequent upon the collapse of their economy, the political system is also virtually collapsed. And China is also building good friendship with Sri Lanka, and in return, during the COVID-19 pandemic, COVID pandemic was reaching its peak. What the Sri Lankan government was said to have leased out some islands of Sri Lanka to be used by China. And in view of this, do you think China's foreign diplomacy can affect our security as a great Indian? Okay, thank you, sir.
Before our guests react to that question, let me try to point out that since we are running out of time, Professor Rintuanga's question will be our last questions, which our esteemed guest would react to. And after the reaction, I would like to call upon Professor Dongel to give a short vote of thanks. Okay, sir.
Thank you. Well, very interesting question. No, in my view, it's not as if we are too late or we have missed the bus. I don't think that is correct. But one point is certainly there, that the Chinese economic outreach and Chinese economic capacities are far in excess of ours. So their capacity to implement projects, their capacities to and by implementing projects to project their influence, to give a huge amount of economic aid to build up infrastructure, that's actually quite a there's quite a big difference between our capacities and their capacities. But for that, from that I don't draw the conclusion that we have missed the bus, because let's be clear, we are able to act east and look east not because we want to do so, but because those countries also want us in. And they want you in for the same reason, that they want someone who can also help balance China for some reason. You know, when you look at Southeast Asia, when you look at Myanmar, it's not as if you're dealing with plasticine and you can do what you want. It is the agency of those countries also which is there. And they also want you in, because they don't want to have an open field for China, because they have their own concerns, their own apprehensions and their own views about China. So I see it as a much more dynamic situation, yes, but I agree that the Chinese have capacities which are presently, it may not be forever, may change in 5 years, 10 years, but presently they are far in excess of ours, and that enables it to have a huge outreach. But it doesn't mean because of that we have missed our bus. I think we bring other things to the table. Most of all, countries want us in because they feel that we can balance, we can stabilize, that we will not, we go there with a different set of points than the Chinese do. Now, the Sri Lankan example is a good one, because the Sri Lankans thought that the Chinese have the answer to all their problems, and then they discovered in a very painful way the downside, because they faced a huge debt crisis, they were unable to service the debt, and then at crunch time they found that the Chinese also are not able to help them, and they had to come back to India for with various requests and so on. But I said so, but I think, you know, we have to reconcile to the fact, and we have to adapt and deal with it, that the Chinese are going to be playing a big role in South Asia. Because after all, if they are playing a big role in India, you know, where if you look at the amount we import from China, the economic dependence we have on China, in your critical sectors, you get most of the inputs from China. And the Chinese economy, to a great extent, has become an opportunity for Indian business. And it's the same in our neighbors also. So you can't say, I will do something and I won't let you do it. So it's a dynamic situation, you have to deal with it. But I don't think we have missed any bus. And I think you bring to the table certain qualities which these countries want. And that is what makes your diplomacy possible.
Chairman of the program, Dr. J.C. Zomuanthanga. Our guest speaker, Dr. TCA Raghavan, Dean, School of Social Sciences, Professor Lalneihzovi, former Dean, and my senior colleague, Professor Srinivas Pathi, Professor Lalneihzovi, other colleagues from the school, my dear scholars and students. It is indeed a privilege that today we have interaction with academician come diplomat. And before I propose vote of thanks, as senior most faculty of the department, I would like to give just few observations. How the lecture series of diplomat now is different from the earlier lecture. In pre-COVID era, we had about 4 special lectures with diplomats. And frankly speaking, academicians, we speak out what we think clearly without reservation. So those pre-COVID lecture series, most of the speakers, they are purely purely diplomat with bureaucratic mindset. That was a fact. But today we have Dr. TCA Raghavan, who is also academician, PhD holder in history, and who has academic mindset. Diplomat with academic mindset. We should give him a big hand. And the interaction, the lecture, and the way how presentation is going on. It is really academic and to the point. And I look around, most of my students, they don't feel bored at all, sir. So we are so thankful to you. And as senior most faculty of the department, I express my heartfelt thanks on behalf of the department to you. And today I feel sorry to admit that I was the keynote speaker in national seminar organized by Patsunga University College inside the city. Just after my program, I came down and I could not listen to the beginning of the lecture, but after my arrival also, I listened to whatever expressed attentively, and I think it is very helpful. And as I've said, our speaker today is academician, historian, and diplomat. So he balanced his knowledge as academician and diplomat wisely and to the point. And like, sir, I would like to bring to your attention some local issue, which policy makers in Delhi may not be aware of it. But as historian, I think you will be aware of it. Whatever it is, I just want to point out. See, we talk about look-east policy, border trade, act-east policy. But even before the introduction of this border trade, look-east policy, act-east policy, trade is going on since pre-colonial era. And in pre-colonial era, there was no demarcation of international boundary and national boundary. Those people who are now separated by this national international boundary, they live in the same territory. But because of colonial demarcation of boundary for its own administrative conveniences, particularly these zooethnic tribes, they are now divided into India, Burma, and Bangladesh. And due to that, since time immemorial, they had village trade. And even before the introduction of look-east policy, border trade, and act-east policy, village trade was there, and even now village trade is going on. Even then, even after the military takeover in Myanmar, see, village trade is still going on. So in the month of August, on 23rd August, BBC correspondent interviewed me for documentary on Myanmar refugee. And the interview was broadcasted on 20th September. Then BBC correspondent asked me why refugee cross international border and come from Chin state to Mizoram, then from second region of Burma to Manipur. Then I told the BBC correspondent, the so-called international boundary is being the creation of the colonial ruler. They are in one territory earlier, and due to that, those people, they don't have nowhere to go except to approach their blood relative brothers in Manipur and Burma. So I told the BBC correspondent, blood is thicker than national boundary and international boundary. So that is how the local situation is here. Due to that, and to successfully implement this look-east and act-east also, policy maker in Delhi should be aware of the local reality here, sir. You may be aware of it, but just for information and for awareness of the students, I am just pointing out that. And we are thankful for the encouraging and convincing lecture today. So today, at the outset, I am thankful to Dean School of Social Sciences, Professor Lalneihzovi, for allowing us to use this conference hall for this program. So we are thankful to her. And we are also thankful to my colleague, Dr. Jangu, and my student, C. Lalnundika, for sparing their valuable times and picking up and welcoming our guest speaker at Lengpu Airport yesterday. So the department is so thankful to them. And we are also thankful to our staff, non-teaching staff in the department, Pimanungi, and other staff for doing all the needful work. And we are also thankful to students for helping us in arranging this program. And today, we have seen students and colleagues from particularly students from other schools also. And we are also thankful to our scholar Pinky for bringing our students from Government Rangbana College. And we also expect that this be the beginning. So you should come and join us in future also if this type of program is organized again. And all the students, scholars from the department and from other departments and from the school also, the department is so thankful to you. So we are thankful for being here from the beginning till the end of the program.